So with that, I'm going to start the recording. And I'm going to turn my webcam off and turn it over to John. I hope you enjoyed today's session.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. Very brief biography. One is that I have been a writer in interpretation issues for a long time. Just this month, in fact, I'm celebrating my 20th anniversary as an NAI member. And I've been writing all that time, and actually this month with this Legacy article is my 40th NAI publication, from books, journals, Legacy, and others. But my goal has been, and always been, to really push the limits, explore new areas of interpretation, especially from a holistic point of view. So this area that we're about to investigate is another aspect of trying to do that. I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit called the Global Heritage Consortium, and our mission is to apply or promote holistic focus to heritage management, natural and cultural. Matter of fact, we have a cooperative agreement with NAI to offer interpretation webinars in Spanish, and we're actually having our next one tomorrow. We're trying Zoom for the first time. So anyway, before I actually introduce this webinar, I would like to start by pointing out that really our job as interpreters is ultimately to help people connect formally invisible or formally disconnected dots about our world and about heritage. And first, those dots need to be visible to the interpreter. The dots are like stars in that they are numerous beyond count. And like stars, most of these dots in our mysterious universe are invisible. I'm going to start off here with a video. And this video is one of the most famous dots in this constellation of examples in the UFO world. And this is the famous Tic Tac. So it's only about 30-something seconds. So I'm going to post this into the chat. And if you could all watch it and then come back in just a little while, hopefully less than a minute, we'll discuss it. So here it is, and I'll wait for you. Actually, if you just put in the chat you're back, that would be great.
Articles that are posted in our
Alright, welcome back, Lindsay. Susie's back. Brady. Video. Certainly you can find that longer video on YouTube if you want. And for those, that's a little dot in a dark field. I'm glad you mentioned that, Ingrid, because this gives you an idea of what you were looking at. Diagram of the proportions of the size to a person, and you can see why it's informally called the Tic Tac. Now what I want to talk about, this is one of the most famous examples of of UFOs, and we'll look at why that is. Now, in the UFO field, there's what's called the 5 observables. These are 5 high-performance aspects. The more elements, more of these 5 observables that a sighting has, the higher its credibility or its importance. I'm taking these, there's 4 of them here, but the one's combined into, this has come from the very brand new What's Up with UFOs website. You can see the criteria for extraordinary performance. The first one is anti-gravity. And indeed, this Tic Tac does demonstrate anti-gravity lift. Matter of fact, it was able to turn very quickly, and other UFOs can oftentimes turn 90-degree angles without slowing down. Which, of course, in a regular gravity ship, an airplane, that would crush the pilot, but apparently doesn't crush whoever's piloting these things. The second one, which is part of anti-gravity in this system, is sudden and instantaneous acceleration. It's able to go from zero to very high speed. As a matter of fact, this Tic Tac, I think, was clocked at over 5,000 miles per hour. The third is hypersonic velocity. They kind of gave that away. It's very fast. And no propulsion signatures. So this, like most UFOs, has no sonic boom, has no heat signature on infrared, and has no vapor trail. So that's indicating a different kind of technology. The next one, it says underwater here, but in more general terms, it's trans-medium travel. And indeed, the Tic Tac, although I don't think you saw it in this video, but did go underwater also, did fly in the air, and presumably space, although that's not in the video in this case. Cloaking and low observability, I don't think that was characteristic of this particular UFO, so that one wouldn't apply as far as I know. There is a fifth one that isn't mentioned here also, and for an additional, well, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So those are the criteria. So 4 out of 5 of those criteria apply in this particular case. Now also I want you to look at the criteria for reliability, because different UFO sightings have different reliability. Matter of fact, about 90% of them have conventional explanations when they're vetted. So we want to see, is there video footage, there's photos, who saw this? There's just regular people, quote unquote, or are there trained eyewitnesses, experts? How long was this sighting? And whether or not they were radar returns, because a radar return indicates that something physical was actually detected on radar. And in this particular case, we have extensive video reporting. It was a prolonged encounter. As a matter of fact, over radar, they had been tracking objects for several days prior to these videos. And then 2 rounds of FA Super Hornet fighters went out to engage the UFO. The video is from the second round. And I mentioned there are radar returns, so there was something physical that was detected. And multiple expert witnesses. They were Top Gun pilots who were experts in identifying objects in space, in air I should say, radio operators, radar operators, and weapons system operators, and many of them. There is a 5th criterion not mentioned here, and that's government vetting. And this video, along with 2 other famous videos, was revealed in a front page story in the New York Times in 2017, which we'll talk about a little later. And last year, the Navy itself verified these as official UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, and released them to the public because they decided they didn't have any classified information as well. So that is just one of many famous examples, and like any UFO ET or ED case, people do try to debunk them, and of course a lot of these things are debunked. Like I said, 90% of sightings do have conventional explanations, and in this particular case, people have said this is just a reflection of an airplane on a cloud. Other people have argued that it's not really moving that fast, it's just movement of the camera. Well, they pick 1 or 2 aspects to debunk. What it does ignore is the variety of evidence, that when you take it together, you produce a very strong case. That's the point that we're going to look at a little bit further along. Before that, as Emily said, this webinar is based on the Legacy article. I imagine most people have access to that. If not, just mention in the chat room and I can give you a link to download it. And this webinar, as well as the article itself, reflects my interest in this topic because it really does push the boundaries of interpretation. It pushes many of the cognitive abilities that we use interpretation, our ability to use evidence, and a lot of this topic itself really forces us to take the next step oftentimes as interpreters. So what I'm going to do in this webinar, like in the article, is first we're going to look at some general categories of evidence, some examples in each of the categories, and then we're going to look at the implications for interpretation. Why is it potentially valuable to study this topic 4 interpreters. Now, of course, I'm going to ask you, if you don't already do this, is try and suspend your disbelief, at least during this presentation. Just take these ideas without judging them for the moment. You can do that afterwards. And as each new idea appears, picture it as another star appearing in the sky. By the end, you'll have many stars in the sky. But if you don't allow the sky to fill up with these different points, you won't be able to appreciate the big picture once we integrate them and take them together. And you'll miss one of the main approaches, trying to bring meaning to this crazy world of extra-dimensionals and extraterrestrials. So let's first start off with the first category of evidence, and that's physical evidence. Here you see a picture of the actual fighter pilot who took that video recording of Tic Tac, and there are extensive interviews with him on YouTube if you wanted to find out more. Physical evidence falls into a variety of different categories, such as we mentioned, radar returns, photography, and video. And here I'm going to just show you a few of the most famous photographs that haven't been debunked over the years. You might know in the upper right-hand corner, one of the best photos actually comes from the country where I'm living now, Costa Rica. This picture was actually taken from a survey plane who was just creating a topographical map of a part of Costa Rica, and eventually they saw this image after the fact. And I'm also going to show you a video right now, very quick. I only watched the first 45 seconds because for some reason the video repeats itself at that point. So once again, after you look at it, you come back and tell me in the chat. Back again first. Alrighty. Great. But everyone's back now. Now this video is not a verified video, so I can't tell you whether it's authentic or not. I'm unaware if it's been vetted. But I am sharing it with you, once again, as an example of a kind of evidence. But this is particularly fascinating because it demonstrates both a UFO or a UAP as well as crop circle, and I've never seen another video of someone actually seeing the crop circle being produced. So just another kind of example. Other kinds of physical evidence would be, for example, alien implants, and there's many examples of people having these strange implants, and a number of them have been removed. There's several books on them. There's one doctor in particular who's quite famous for that, and a documentary which I have posted here. Very often when there's UFO landings, they leave burn marks, they leave radiation, they disturb vegetation. This particular photo from Rendlesham Forest in 1982 is Britain's most famous UFO. It's sort of their Roswell. There's a lot of photography. The person even touched one of the craft itself and apparently got radiation burn. In the picture above, you see an example of what's called a metamaterial. Metamaterials are materials that are constructed. They're not found in nature. There are a lot of metamaterials that our own scientists have produced, but there's also some metamaterials that either come from crash recoveries or have fallen off craft or possibly some other explanation for their production, but apparently haven't been produced on Earth. The technology isn't known. They have isotope ratios that can't be found on the planet. So it's another kind of physical evidence. Now I'm going to pass on to the next category of testimonial evidence, and this is the tagline that appears on What's Up with UFO's website, that there are many credible people saying incredible things. And thus, certainly credibility is very important, as it is in a court of law. So let me just start off by one kind of testimony evidence is indirect, and it's survey data. Lots of surveys have been done, both nationally and globally. I just cited 4 here, which do appear in the Legacy article. Just a very recent survey by Gallup, and I imagine you all know that Gallup is one of the most prestigious survey organizations, found that 1/3 of Americans believe ET spacecraft are visiting Earth. It doesn't ask how many believe in ET, just how many believe spacecraft are visiting Earth. When you ask that question, then you have this 2017 survey commissioned by the 20th Century Fox to promote their movie. They found that 47% of Americans believe in alien life somewhere. Locality's global study in 2015 showed that 61% believe there is life on other planets. It's a global study. And a 2015 YouGov poll found that 56% of Germans, compared with 54% Americans, 52% are British. So poll after poll indicates about half of the people in the world believe in ET intelligence somewhere. Of course, that depends on the question and the survey and the population being surveyed. But the point you take away from this is not a fringe belief. This is a large belief, and it also is similar to the belief, the percentage of people who believe in God. Of course, those aren't mutually exclusive by any means. Another very interesting form of testimonial evidence, this comes from abduction studies. These are 2 of the most famous books, perhaps the 2 most famous books of abduction studies. Those are people who claim to have been abducted by extraterrestrials, taken on ships. John Mack is a psychiatrist. He's actually the founder of the psychiatry department at Harvard University, Pulitzer Prize winner. He wrote this book after working with about 100 different people. He basically concluded that nobody was crazy. And then Whitley Strieber, who's a writer, wrote in his famous book Communion about his own experience. Now the reason why I'm showing you these is because after each one of these were published, people wrote in letters to the authors. John Mack received 40,000 letters, and Whitley Strieber received 250,000 letters from people sharing their experiences, their abduction experiences, who were very grateful that it was legitimized by the publication of these books. And when you consider that most people would never even report their experiences, the numbers of people who claim to have had these experiences is much, much higher. While we're talking about numbers with 000s, also look at UFO reporting. You may or may not know that there is a national UFO reporting center. It's been going on for not sure how many years, and it has over 90,000 records in it. These are vetted records, and here I took data from the most recent update, which is halfway through May, as you can see here, and there's evidence here that they do vet them. Here, these circles, you can see that one person reported what are probably Starlink satellites, other people confusing Venus, and as I had mentioned before, some 90%, this is based on multiple different reports from around the world, about 90% of sightings do have conventional explanations. But this 90,000 records that they have in their database is mostly United States, mostly English, and once again, doesn't include people from other countries, doesn't include other languages, and there doesn't include the fact that most people don't actually report their sightings. So, another interesting form of evidence are people who are reporting. But people in particular, such as musicians. And it's interesting how many famous musicians have reported being influenced by extraterrestrials and influenced their own work. Just a few: Elvis Presley, Michael Jackson, Rolling Stones, Marilyn Mansfield, the Beatles, David Bowie, quite a few others. Writers as well, and artists. This particular artist is particularly interesting because she's a Serbian artist. She works with clients who have some kind of connection, whether it's past life or they've been visited or channeling, and she works with them to communicate with the actual, at least this is what she says, to communicate with the entities and try to depict them. Of course, it depends on the entities wanting to cooperate. But go to her website, and just the artistic value alone is worth a trip. Then, of course, you Bashta.com. Just quickly type that in here. Bashta.com. Can't remember her first name. And then other kinds of testimonials, channelers. There's thousands of channelers currently active around the world right now. Several famous ones, which I mentioned in the article. Many studies using regression analyses, that would be like a hypnosis, on whether they're abductees or past lives, or all different aspects. But many thousands of people by a whole variety of different kinds of psychologists have worked on that. Then there's reincarnation studies. For example, at the University of Virginia, the Division of Perceptual Studies has been going on since 1964 and has a very large database of interviews with children 7 and under. Apparently after 7 you tend to forget those past life experiences. That is also a very interesting example. So again, this is just a smattering of different kinds of evidence. Nothing is proven, they all have their counterpoints. But again, taken together, it produces at least an interesting case that there's millions of people out there who've had one kind of experience or another. That's an awful lot of people. The next category would be historical evidence. Historical evidence includes looking back in the past record, whether it's archaeological, whether it's artistic, whether there are texts. This is one cave paintings. There's many cave paintings from around the world, sometimes going back 30 and 40,000 years, depicting images that certainly look either like craft or look like individuals. This is from Australia. This dates to 3000 BC. The analysts point out the eyes, which could be inferred as characteristic of the typical gray alien, as well as the auras around their heads. And if you could do a quick search on Google, and you'll find many examples from all over the world. This is actually one of the younger ones, being in 3000 BC. Then there's religious studies of cosmologies, Native American cosmologies, oral histories of star beings as ancestors. I don't remember if I talk about it later, but Professor Emeritus at University of Montana, Dr. R.D. Six-Killer Clark, who's Native American herself, has collected hundreds of oral histories from tribes all across North and Central America. Found that the majority of tribes seem to have star beings, which is today called extraterrestrials, as part of their ancestors, as part of their creation stories. There's a lot of work that's been done in studying ancient aliens. If you've ever watched the Ancient Aliens on History Channel, which is in its 15th year, you see a lot of work is done in architecture. Actually, I skipped over this paintings one. There's work that's been studied. That the font did not come through here. So this first painting was done by a student of Rembrandt in 14-something.
It's 1:30.
And because Rembrandt had access to the Vatican's art archives, it was assumed that the student may have as well. I can't remember his name. It was written here above. And if you notice, the 4 beams coming down from what looks like a craft is very uncharacteristic of divine images. This is the Annunciation. What is it? Something. Anyway, it's a Christ picture, and the 4 beings has been interpreted as this is secret Vatican knowledge that's being shared publicly. Another example, again, you can't see, this is the Annunciation. When Mary, you can see her in the lower right, before she gives birth, this is when she found out that she's pregnant with Christ. There's an image again of a disc-shaped object with a beam coming down, and the interpretation that's been given to this is that oftentimes in abductions, a light comes through the windows, and that maybe the Mary was abducted, and that might account for Christ. Again, these are 2 examples of many examples. This is a really rich area of study of paintings, not just in Christian, but in many different religions and backgrounds. Certainly could spend a whole career in art. His Baptism of Jesus. Thank you, folks. See you later. Anyway, back to the idea of architecture. There's been a lot of work and a lot of writing about many of our famous archaeological sites and structures such as the pyramid and Stonehenge, talking about having architectural aspects and spiritual aspects that architects and archaeologists question whether they could have been done by the people at the time with the current technology. And this is again the image for the Native Americans. I visited it last year to Tiwanaku, which is a site on the Bolivian side of the lake of Lake Titicaca, and I took some pictures of different engineering aspects. You can see in the upper right hand corner it's very smooth, and presumably when it was done it was as smooth as glass, with a line that's perfectly vertical and perfectly spaced tiny pinpoint holes. And in other cases there's curvatures that mining engineers and some archaeologists say couldn't have been done with the stone or the bronze tools of the time. If that's the case, and all I can do is repeat the evidence since I don't know about that, then what other explanations could there be? There's certainly the idea that maybe they had some technique that just isn't represented in the archaeological evidence, so that's speculation. Maybe there was a civilization that existed there 10,000 years ago and actually had that technology, because there's a lot of work on ancient technology. But there's no archaeological evidence for that at this site either. And then of course you have the ET explanation, which, like the previous two, is also speculative because there is no archaeological evidence. But when you have these questions and uncertainty, this space of uncertainty is what creates new theories, right? This is what happens when there's uncertainty. And this is something, of course, that's very important for interpreters, because it's in this space of uncertainty that we are provoked to explore and come up with new ideas and make new connections. We'll get back to that point. So a fourth category would be government leaks and disclosures. This is a very interesting space right now, and has been for the history since the 50s. Many documents have come out of the government, sometimes by whistleblowers, but many times they've just been declassified and picked up by Freedom of Information Act. Richard Dolan is the most well-known historian in government disclosure and ufology, with many books, and he has identified 12 government documents that pretty clearly show how seriously the U.S. government takes UFOs, or UAPs, or AAVs, which is another term used today, the autonomous aerial vehicles. These are terms to avoid the negative baggage of the term UFO. I'm just going to show you 4 earlier ones that are on his list. General Nathan Twining in 1947 describes UFOs as real. He sends a memo to the Air Force General, George Shulgin, the very highest level of the Air Force. In 1949, there was an FBI memo sent to J. Edgar Hoover. Everyone here is American, I think, so everyone knows who he was, informing about meetings between the Army G2 office, I don't know what that is, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations that they were having about UFOs. 1952, H. Marshall Chadwell, who is the CIA Director of Scientific Intelligence, writes the Director of CIA, General Walter Bedell Smith, about his concern about the seriousness of UFO phenomena. 1952, Maxwell Air Force Base writes the Commander of Air Defense Command about repeated airspace violations by strange stationary objects. Like I didn't make those corrections in time, spelling mistakes. So you can easily find this page. It's on his website, but you can just do a search and find them. In addition to government documents that have been acquired through FOIA, there's a project called the Disclosure Project, based out of Washington. That's amassed G2 intelligence. Thanks, Clark. Hundreds of testimonials of high credibility whistleblowers from government and industry. And they've gone on record, video records, about government research in UFOs, UFO programs, captured UFOs, reverse engineering, many different topics. And these are oftentimes generals, these are engineers, very impressive cast of folks. And while we're on the topic of reverse engineering of crashed craft, we would be remiss not to mention the most famous example, Bob Lazar, who claims to be an engineer who worked on reverse engineering outside of Area 51 in a laboratory called S4. There's a documentary, you can get it on Netflix, and he reports, as well as having seen a hangar with 9 alien craft lined up in this hangar. There are counterpoints to his story. There are people who call into question whether in fact he really was an MIT graduate, and then Lazar claims that his records were expunged by the government. So like many stories in ufology, it gets pretty messy. But that's part of the challenge and part of the fascination of a lot of these stories, is that they're not simple, and they're not smoking guns. Another area of government leaks, and this is a historical moment in ufology, is that on December 16th, 2017, 2 days before my birthday, the New York Times had a historical cover page story breaking the news on the existence of ATIP, which is the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, the U.S. government program that had been operating for 20 years and had spent over $22 million investigating UFOs and actually paranormal phenomena as well, among other things. So once this story broke, the landscape in the mainstream media changed completely. And I'll show you in a little while how that happened. They reported on those 3 famous videos, including the Tic Tac. You can find this now on the web if you want to read it. I'll conclude this section by saying that also many countries have UFO programs and files, and they've gone public with them. Canada, France, Peru, Chile, the UK, Italy. In the case of France, they published all of their entire data set. Because in France, they look at UFOs as a scientific question, not as a national security question, as we do in the United States. Now I want to share with something that is breaking news. Yesterday, I just found out about it this morning, and the Select Senate Committee on Intelligence is required in the draft bill of the Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021. Hasn't been passed yet. But the Select, and Marco Rubio, for example, is one of the senators on this committee. They are requiring that the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force at the Office of Naval Intelligence, quote, in consultation with the Secretary of Defense, unquote, issue within 180 days of the approval of this act an unclassified report that brings together reporting from all the different elements of the U.S. government and military and intelligence agencies into one report about unidentified aerial phenomena and autonomous aerial vehicles. Those are the terms that they use. The U.S. government uses now. This is land break, and this is massive. It is the government going public. This is not even a classified. They said you can have a classified appendix, but the document will be unclassified, and it will be reported not only to the Senate Committee on Intelligence, but the Senate Committee on Armed Forces. So this is really big, and it's not disclosure, but it is the government upping the ante on its transparency and all the work it has been and is currently doing on research. It's framed in a national security frame, because that's the U.S. government's main interest. If any of these aerial vehicles are a threat to U.S. national security, which is a legitimate concern. But we all know from the past that they've investigated many other things that aren't aerial threats. Matter of fact, very few UFOs that are even categorized as aerial threats by the U.S. government. Anyway, so that's the government leaks and disclosures. Now I wanted to talk about a little bit more about the nature of evidence. There's actually a big irony in the field, and ufology is really not even the field. It's broader than that, because this includes paranormal and other areas as well. But those who study it say there's so much evidence, and as you probably know, many educated people who don't really study it say there isn't any evidence, that it's just speculation. Typically those are people who just look at SETI as their only known source of evidence, and of course SETI hasn't produced anything in all the years that it's been operating. So what I want to do now is make a distinction, and this wasn't covered in the Legacy article, there wasn't space, between legal evidence and scientific evidence. Because oftentimes you hear people say, well, there really isn't scientific evidence of UFOs, which is partially true. It's certainly not as rigorous. But if you look at the legal evidence on the left-hand side, these are forms of evidence that are admissible in U.S. courts under current judicial law in the United States. Now, I can't tell you what all of these kinds are, especially towards the end of the list. But you can see just from what we've gone over already that most of these forms of evidence UFOs have an abundance of. Anecdotal, hearsay, testimonial, direct, circumstantial, expert witness, forensic, trace, physical, documentary, statistical, and I don't know what analogical is, etc., etc. So the evidence that is being produced in large quantities about UFOs and paranormal is, if there were actually a court case, which there really hasn't been, although there have been hearings, congressional hearings, but they would be admissible under U.S. law, or at least under precedent. I'm not a lawyer. You can see on the other side, the weakest at the top and the strongest at the bottom, anecdotal, animal, and you're going down the list, and why there isn't so much scientific evidence, or a strong scientific case as there would be on a legal case, is that the nature of these kind of anomalous phenomena make it very hard to study. You can't really study them in laboratories, or certainly not very well. You can't have systematic, controlled experiments with them. They don't allow themselves to do that. UFOs don't allow themselves to do that. Neither do paranormal phenomena. It's very hard to produce paranormal phenomena in a laboratory. Apparently, paranormal comes when people are under stress very oftentimes. There is some laboratory work done in paranormal and in psi. They have done statistical significant studies of people being able to detect what the images are on a screen greater than the random chance alone. But oftentimes in our field, just like in history, the historical field in general, we draw from the left-hand side, and increasingly from the right. So, again, when people say there's not much scientific evidence, that is partially true. But what about the legal evidence, or the other kinds of evidence that many social science fields, especially history, use in the legal system? So, there is one other kind of evidence that I want to mention, or another kind of categorization of evidence, and that's called first-person, second-person, and third-person evidence. So if I have a personal sighting of a UFO in the sky, that's first person, and that is the kind of evidence that, of course, generates the most emotion, and oftentimes is the most convincing. Second-person evidence, and I've never had any first-person evidence myself. Second person is when you know somebody who has had a first-person experience, and because you know them, that is more powerful than third person, which is the vast majority. That's kind of the objective evidence that you find in studies and documented, produced by people that you don't know, third parties. And it is important to consider this because, depending on who your audience is, that first person, second person, third person combination is really important. Anyway, all of these different kinds of evidence, another way to examine this field is, what are the large meta patterns, or the big patterns? Because oftentimes those are the most convincing. As I mentioned, most of the time you can debunk out any particular case, particular video, particular sighting, and you can pick them off one at a time, and that's what skeptics oftentimes do. But where the really convincing argument is, and I don't mean convincing like, yes, it exists, I mean convincing like, take it seriously, is the vast patterns that begin to emerge from all of this testimonial evidence, from all of this physical evidence, from all this historical evidence. Because in U.S. court of law, that's what a jury does, right? The prosecution presents all different kinds of evidence, the defense tries to pick off those different evidence, and the jury has the responsibility to look at the entire argument and come away with its best estimate, whether it's beyond reasonable doubt or not. It's the same approach here. So one final note on evidence then is that in psychology, evidence alone obviously cannot change belief systems. If someone is entrenched in resistance to the existence of UFOs, then presenting all the evidence in the world isn't going to make a difference. Maybe what would make a difference is a first-person experience, but maybe not even that. So presumably, if you're here in this webinar, it's because you have a certain openness and curiosity to that. But again, that's not an obligation by any means. While we're on the topic, I'd like to ask you all, if maybe I'm going to just ask you two questions that you can answer anonymously in a poll here. And the first one is, Have you ever had any kind of ET or paranormal sighting or experience? Again, you don't have to reveal your name. As a matter of fact, there's no way to know. And the second question is, do you know anyone who has had an ET or paranormal? How come there's only one option here, Emily?
Hold on, let me fix it.
Well, we could just go with the first question.
No, it's fine, it'll take a second.
We have 9 people currently in the... Oh, wow, that was fast. Thanks. Okay, so here we go. If you want to vote, do you know anyone who has had an ET or paranormal? I would vote yes, quite a few. I regret that I never have. So you can already see from the results here, and this isn't surprising since this is a self-selected audience, that 5 or 71% out of the 9 have, well actually sorry, I guess 7, 2 people didn't vote. And same results in the other case. I don't know if anybody would like to share, just maybe one person, if you'd like to share an experience you've had. If not, that's fine. I'm going to remove these results now. Okay, I don't see anyone raising hand or writing, so we'll move on. The next thing I want to talk about is the taboo. As you've all heard of taboos, and certainly you know in certain spaces when a taboo exists, it's hard to go against that taboo, like in ETs. For a long time, and it currently still is, a cultural taboo against taking the topic seriously. I'm sure you've felt it. I've certainly felt it since publishing this article. And taboo is one factor that influences our beliefs. Also, this personal experience, your religion, other credible people in your life who you respect, who have an opinion, and of course your personal interests. So there's a number of different factors, of which taboo is just one. But this particular taboo, I just wanted to go into a little more detail, because it's not just a random ethereal thing. The taboo has been studied, especially by Richard Dolan and others, and there seems to be I don't know if consensus is quite the right word, but many who agree that this taboo goes back some 60 years, and it has ruined careers, generated many government denials. The official position before 2017 of the government is that UFOs don't exist, and we're not interested. Which we now know was never the case. That was never the real position of the U.S. government. And you may have all felt this taboo, even maybe deciding if you wanted to join this webinar or not. So let me just show you the power of a taboo, and this would fall into the category of circumstantial evidence under the list of it. But on June 5th, when I shared this on certain groups, interpretation groups, I published or copied the article, and right beneath the article we got comments from some people. One person wrote, "I have to say I find this disconcerting. We're struggling to communicate real science to the public that our professional organization would publish what appears to me to be pseudoscience better fitted to sensational cable TV, coast-to-coast AM, does not make it easier." And the reason I mention this is because this is right beneath the article. And it seems to me, and again, this is circumstantial, that it would be hard to just say a pseudoscience with no evidence if it actually had seen the article. And similarly, another person wrote, "To me this is different from historical viewpoint because there is written evidence to support views and one can assess authors for credibility." Which of course is totally true in the UFO literature as well. There's hundreds and hundreds of books, tens of thousands of documented reportings, historical documents. Again, a lot of those have counterpoints. I'm not saying there's any slam dunks. There's no slam dunks in this business. But to say that means, once again, they probably didn't look. So, for some reason, whether it's the taboo or the beliefs that they came independent of the taboo, they probably didn't even read the article before they made these comments. Or maybe they did. That's why it's circumstantial. Who knows? But anyway, like I mentioned, this taboo has been traced back to... Taboo is a bias, but it's one that we're acculturated. It comes from our group. It could be, in your family, just in your nuclear family, there's something that you can't talk about. because maybe it has to do with alcoholism and you just don't talk about that in your family. Or it can be culture-wide, and it's the society telling you no taboo. Indigenous groups have taboos too, oftentimes to protect sacred spaces. Don't go into that space or spirit will take revenge. I have a colleague who works in sacred conservation and talks about those different kinds of taboos. In any event, so the taboo itself has been traced back to a report that was published in 1968. So a few folks have threatened to leave or not renew their membership because of this topic. There you go. In 1968, a report was published called the Condon Report. This was actually commissioned by the U.S. government at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And the conclusion, interestingly, in this report, they actually documented many credible sightings and cases. But despite that, they concluded, our general conclusion is nothing has come from the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. Careful consideration of the record, as it is available to us, leads us to conclude that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified in the expectation that science will be advanced thereby. And after this, in fact, there was no government funding. Many researchers were no longer able to work in this area. And, whether or not the U.S. government itself actually took its following from this, it's generally believed that the intent of the report was to discredit UFO on purpose. It wasn't an objective report. And there's some good reasons for that. Again, these are somewhat speculative, but there is a lot of work that's been done in each of these three. For example, in the economic reasons not to allow this to happen, because there are new energy technologies possibly recovered from craft, such as free energy. And there's evidence, whistleblowers who say the U.S. government already has free energy technology. And if that were to go public, of course, that would immediately replace the whole fossil fuel industry as well as alternative energy industries. Fossil fuel energy is a very powerful industry, so you could see an economic incentive to not wanting to allow that to go public. Saying something should not be funded is a form of competition, and yep, you can see that. There are political reasons why the U.S. government would not want to admit this. For example, the U.S. government wouldn't want other countries to know what it's doing, and of course there's been a lot of competition between China and Russia in space technology and UFO studies over the decades. There's a famous article that was published in a big-name social science journal, Public Policy, I think, and it argued that if the government admitted that UFOs were real, it would lose its sovereignty, because one of the prime reasons we have government is for national security. And the technology that we see reported on these autonomous aerial vehicles is far superior to anything that likely humans have, and it would undermine the main reason of having governments and having military defenses. The most downloaded article, supposedly ever, from that journal. Technologically, you don't want this to go public because there are technologies that elite groups may want to keep to themselves, whether the U.S. military or the aerospace industry. Each one of these has a lot of literature behind them. Whether or not they're true is a different question. But anyway, as I mentioned in that article in the New York Times in 2017, since that publication, flood doors have been opened widely. Many periodicals, famous mainstream publicists, are now regularly publishing. The Atlantic, the Washington Post, New Yorker, Wired, Popular Mechanics, Fox News, CNN. So the flood, since the New York Times published that, it's changed the entire media landscape. And the taboo is quickly taking hits. We all still feel it, but now if you just do some searches for the word UFO or something, you will see many articles, just last year and this year, going on. And I should finally mention that for many people and cultures, this taboo never existed. In Eastern religions and philosophy, Buddhism,
Scientific hope.
In the minds of a group, and then can actually, at least for a period of time, have a certain physicality associated with it. I mean, that's pretty weird. Actually, these are all pretty weird. Now, I'll take the example of a ghost light, which is a naturally occurring electromagnetic phenomenon that often takes the shape of an orb, and they can move. Again, they have no autonomy whatsoever because they are electromagnetic fields in certain weather conditions. But if you have one that's moving, that's traveling along a ridge, it could come into contact, say, with a strong field of collective consciousness, a group of people, and this group of people have a certain archetypal image in their mind of a wild man, and this will convert into that image. Carl Jung talks a lot about the archetypes of collective beings, and how that, through the power of mind, could potentially give it some kind of physical embodiment. May not have any autonomy in the physical world, but would then have some kind of physical manifestation. Another example here, maybe there's an extraterrestrial that's physically embodied state and passes through or takes advantage of electromagnetic energy and transforms herself into an orb being one of the most common forms of ET and UFO sightings, glowing balls. So this is an example of an ET changing form. Another example would be from a poltergeist phenomenon, where a young girl has an imaginary friend, and then she infuses that friend with telekinetic energy because maybe through anger and rage, and that can become a full-blown poltergeist event. The poltergeists in the literature don't actually have any autonomy. They do physically move things in space, independent of what you see in the movies. So here, once again, we have something that starts in the mind and can generate telekinetic behaviors, but has no autonomy. The last example I'm going to give you, for now, of crazy stuff is, and this has been documented by Paul Eno, who is a researcher in ghost phenomena, documented through testimonies, I should say, that it's quite possible that a person in another dimension or an alternative universe actually sees one of us as a ghost, just like we see someone from an alternative universe as a ghost. That somehow through that interdimensional filter, it creates this semi-physical phenomenon, as opposed to them being dead people, which of course is the most common theory in religion and non-religion as well. So, Susie, hold on to that thought and let's talk about this afterwards, because it's a good point. The reproducibility is a really key point when trying to use scientific criteria. Another point, and this goes back to the work of Lindsay, we're going to briefly mention it, is this study also helps to expand potentially our notion of what is heritage. Certainly heritage we have on Earth, and the stuff left over by NASA astronauts can certainly be considered part of heritage. As a matter of fact, there was a movement to declare the landing of the Eagle as a World Heritage Site, but UNESCO said they don't have jurisdiction on the moon. So what happens when you find objects, say, that are on Mars or on a meteor that don't seem to be of human origin? We now expand our human heritage to a galactic heritage concept. How do we handle that in interpretation? So that's heritage. Of course, the study of this gives insight into the power of a taboo in general, and this particular taboo in particular. It unites many fields. That is, if you take this exo studies perspective, many fields that didn't talk to each other. As a matter of fact, they scorned each other previously. The people in the paranormal field and the UFO, the ghost hunters, people who believe in shamanism, theoretical physicists, aerospace technologists. And now there's a space that we create of study, this exo study, that allows us to integrate these areas and find connections between them that never existed prior. And here I just turn off. So this is from the homepage of the Exo Studies, and I encourage you to check this out, where it says Exo Studies is an emerging integrative metafield, meaning it takes many fields and brings them together, exploring the psychological, sociological, and scientific implications of UFO phenomena in all its empirical and mysterious facets. It's actually more than UFO, but for a homepage, the author decided UFO is the place to start. Another important aspect of studying this is the idea of understanding extra dimensions. Time-space physics, interaction with ETs potentially affects everything that we interpret. By leaving out these other dimensions, we potentially leave out a big part of what is reality. And if we stick to just a materialist, conventional scientific mindset, it might be like trying to build a car with only 50% of the parts. And it does violate Tilden's fifth principle. Violet's a strong word. Maybe doesn't fulfill the fifth principle of interpreting wholes. So by bringing more aspects and facets of reality into interpretation, we get a little closer to wholes. It's also important for our audiences, and even from a skeptic point of view, this is very important. If we know that some 50% of the people out there believe in some form extraterrestrial life, that's 50% of your audience every time you do a program. And this doesn't even include surveys about paranormal and psychic abilities, psi, which would increase the percentages even more. Of course, Hollywood proves all the time that this is a topic of great interest, and most of the world is spiritual, whether it's traditionalists in any religion or postmodern spirituality. That means that they believe in a different kind of interdimensionality. So the majority of our audience has some sympathy, even though because of taboo they might not be able to admit it. Somebody, depends on how safe the space feels. While we're talking about our audiences, study of this area gets us closer to helping understand and interpret the existential questions. And it's existential questions that produce the most powerful themes, the most transformative, potentially, programs. So what are some of these questions? The obvious one, are we alone? Are we special in the universe? What does it mean to be human? How does human history figure into a larger galactic history? Is there life after death? How will ET disclosure impact life on Earth? How will the extraterrestrial hypothesis transform heritage interpretation? So, and I think as interpreters, we always want to get to these deeper, most impacting questions, whether or not any of this ET stuff is of interest. I like to think of it as, if we can bring together these different points in our constellation, these different dimensions and facets of reality, it's sort of in the spirit of the classic naturalist. The naturalists who try to understand all different aspects of nature and are able to connect these different aspects of nature. Here we have several different very famous naturalists, and I did honestly try to find more diversity, but historically people with big names haven't been that diverse. I'm sure that's changing. In any event, all of these people are famous for making different kinds of connections for different kinds of audiences. Does anyone know who any of these people are, by the way? Or just put their name in. Yep, David Suzuki in the upper right. He's Canadian. So at least we do have 6 countries represented by this group. David Attenborough, Sir David Attenborough in the upper left, who is British. Excellent. Steve Irwin in the lower right, and his family. Steve is Australian, his wife is American, and his kids are both. Jacques Cousteau in the lower left, who's French, of course. Mills, who's half covered up, American. John Muir, definitely in the middle, upper, who is Scottish. And nobody guessed the last one yet, because my son knows the last one very well. The cartoon one. I Killed by Stingray was Irwin, yes. Anyone mentions it before we move on? The Kratt Brothers, exactly. And the Kratt Brothers are actually two nature cinematographers. And they decided to make a cartoon because there were things that they could not actually film, and they wanted to interpret those for their audiences. But anyway, these are all people who've made quite a living and quite an impact on making connections. Not necessarily extra-dimensional connections, although Muir did write a lot about spirituality and nature. So anyway, so then the final section here is, how do we prepare ourselves better? Both for this area and also for just learning some of these skills. The first thing I'd say is there are many resources now, books and YouTube and organization, many videos, and the two websites I mentioned, ExoStudies, exostudies.org, and whatsupwithufos.org, which is a brand new, this is the first website, the first place that actually tries to bring together evidence, the best evidence about UFOs, and put it in one place. There's 115 short articles and videos that tries to do that. So if you're at all interested in this topic, highly recommend that. What are practices that you could do? You could take up meditation or yoga or energy practices, community service, shamanism, Buddhism, study of integral theory. Take courses going on. There's plenty of courses. As a matter of fact, there's a course going on right now that's based on What's Up with UFOs, and you could still join. If anyone's interested about that, let me know. Or a master course on ExoStudies is coming up later this year. I took the pilot course in ExoStudies, which was very rigorous, philosophically and emotionally, but it changed my life. It introduced me to all of these. I was fairly agnostic about these topics prior to that. You could investigate the extra-dimensional side of whatever you already work in. If you work with medicinal plants, you could investigate ayahuasca as a sacred medicine from South America. If you work in interpreting churches, you could take on the topic which has been discussed in Catholic theologian circles, because the Vatican is actually pretty advanced on UFOs, and they have their own observatory, in fact. And the idea there is that if there are intelligence out on other planets, and Christ is the Son of God, then Christ must have sort of an influence or jurisdiction in other planets. So that's an ongoing discussion about interplanetary Christ. Sounds crazy, but the Church takes it very seriously. If you work on nature and forests, there are many different kinds of extra-dimensional beings that live in forests, fairies, and even Bigfoot. There's a whole field of Bigfoot, field of study. And of course, understanding that taboo and understanding the nature of this taboo opens us up even more to the evidence when we realize what is the effect of the taboo on our perceptions. And of course, the advice that in order to move in this space, you do have to research quality in multiple sources, incredible authors, because there's a lot of crap out there. There's a lot of charlatans, there's a lot of imagination, and you have to sift through it. That's one reason that What's Up with UFO website was created, was to help sift through all of that. So then, in conclusion then, this field is, again, or multiple fields, ExoStudies field, is characterized by enough evidence to take these phenomena seriously. But very often, there's many counterpoints to pretty much everything. There's counterpoints. And that's what keeps us guessing and keeps us studying. There's no smoking ray guns at all. But it is great training for our cognitive, emotional, and spiritual skills that are useful for us in interpreting anything. And ultimately, my point here in presenting this to you and sharing it with the NI community isn't that you should believe in ETs, or even mention them in your programs. That's not really the point. It's about understanding and holding many of these ideas in the face of uncertainty, points in your sky, in your mind, so that you can make new mental connections and new constellations of understanding. And I'd like to thank Dr. Shawnez Jordan Hargens for his collaboration and support in introducing this very demanding field to me. So having said that, we have at least 10 formal minutes where we could have some questions and some discussions. I'm going to go back to Susie's. It was too long for me to read at the time, but I'm going to read that. So Susie writes, I wanted to give this a chance, but I'm afraid I'm firmly in the skeptic camp, okay? While there is a lack of reproducible evidence, definitely, there's a lot of room for, for speculation, but that is not evidence. You're absolutely right. Speculation is not the same as evidence. It's exciting that there is so much unknown, and exploring it through our science is so much more fascinating to me than this. I tried, but I'm afraid I've got to leave. Has Susie gone already? In which case I really won't. Looks like she is gone already. So anyway, we'll take that as part of the background. Okay. Indeed, there are two different kinds of skeptic camps. There are skeptics who are interested in finding truth, and then there are skeptics who are based in a belief system, and their whole goal is to debunk. The fact that Susie was here tells me that she's definitely in the first camp. And being skeptical is a very important cognitive skill, as long as it's not the same as closed off. So yes, and she talks about reproducible evidence, so that's the scientific evidence. There is actually much reproducible evidence. Just take abduction studies, for example, and there's tens of thousands of cases in cultures around the world, in languages around the world, over decades. So that one kind of evidence is highly reproducible. It's not scientific, but it is, social scientific it is. But it's not hard scientific. Because you don't generate in a laboratory an abduction event. At least I've never heard of that. In any event, I'd like to give other people who are here to turn on your microphone or to write down comments and questions. This is what we're here for, and this is the most exciting part, because none of this is easy and straightforward. Poor Lindsay keeps coming and going. So if anyone would like to use their microphone, go for it. What is the most recent, most compelling evidence for me? Depends, compelling for what? I think what I just told you about what happened, what I learned about this morning, that the Senate Committee on Intelligence is requesting this information in a transparent form. That gives a whole lot of legitimacy to government research and the existence and the seriousness that our government and governments around the world give this issue. I find that quite compelling. What is the conclusion of that? If you conclude that, yes, it is serious. Does it mean the vehicles, the autonomous aerial vehicles that we see in the sky are necessarily extraterrestrial? No, it doesn't. There's a lot talking about that. Through crashes, and maybe even through our own research, we've already developed anti-gravity technology, and some of those UFOs are human-made. In the 1930s, Nazi Germany had already begun working what's called on the Bell craft. If you look that up, you'll see images where it's a disc-shaped Bell craft. Whether they did that by themselves, whether they did that through a recovered craft, whether they had help from extraterrestrials, whether it's just a great physicist that they had, of which Einstein came out of. I don't know, I haven't followed that, but there are documentaries on that. A lot of research is being done on that. PhD research, in fact, in history. Okay, other comments, questions? It's certainly okay to be critical in this space. And in fact, that's what we're encouraging, and that's what interpreters should be. Everybody should be, easy to say, but it's more of a profession.
Yeah, John.
Yes.
This is Mark. I think one thing, well, this has been very interesting, and it's not something that I'm not unfamiliar with. I would suggest, or ask actually more, this whole presentation and some of the responses that you have received about the article, I'm wondering how this is a case study in interpretation. Because what I'm seeing here, and I keep coming back to, is while this is very interesting, is this presentation interpretive? Is it, what is the point that you're making as it relates to the field of interpretation and the practice of interpretation, as opposed to specific subject content?
Well, I would turn that question around in the audience. What is my theme or my objective out of this presentation? And is it interpretive? A fair question. And when you mentioned case study, I thought you meant this whole interaction between this article and this webinar with the interpretive community. And I was going to say, it actually is an interesting case study of what happens when new paradigms bump up against your limits. How do you react? Do you close yourself off? Do you swear at the person who presents this? Do you open yourself and examine it? How do you handle? We all consider ourselves open-minded. What does open-minded mean? And what does it include? I think this has been a case study for me too about that nature, because it's very close to me now.
And that I think is the point, because with the interpreter, if you were talking about what your theme was, you presented that very well at the end of your talk, which is being able to look at things in new ways, different ways, hold different things in the mind as an interpreter. I would have to go back and look at your actual wording, but you did state that at the very end, and I thought that was the theme. And I was wondering how different the reaction in the interpretive community would have been to this if that had been at the start. If that had been how this was structured. Because it is very easy to become normative in our presentations, telling people what things should be, as opposed to respecting individuals' abilities and starting where they are, not where we are.
Right. Very often that's what we find in interpretive sites, is there is a story that wants to be told by that site, and maybe not fully understanding how partial every story is, and that there are a lot of other ideas in the audience. Bringing those together creates sparks, and those sparks, as provocation, can create new meaning, which I think is ultimately what we want to do in interpretation. So, of course, some people come to this, and because they so deeply believe that ETs aren't real, it's just a knee-jerk rejection, and that there's no meaning created. And other people, they may not believe, but they're open, and there is space for creating new meaning. So all this effort, I guess, is for them.
That's very true, and that's something as practitioners of the art of interpretation, and especially this is I would say an extreme point, but what you pointed out of at different sites running into that. If our role is to help others as interpreters, and our role is to remove barriers of participation, then how we go about presenting controversial material so that barriers are not created,
right,
or is the art of interpretation. And I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Sure. And that's very topical right now. With the protests, there's lots of debate in the mainstream media about how to handle monuments. Should they be taken down? Should they be edited? Should they be located in new places? How do we tell those stories? Do we tell them to the exclusion of others? I mean, the Confederates are real people. They believe what they believe. And I think everyone has a right to believe what they believe, because no one chooses their beliefs. And to heal a country, you don't just reject previous stories, even if you totally disagree with them. And we're seeing that play out on the national and international landscape. I'm not saying I have the answer to that, but a lot of the skills that we're talking about here in this webinar are directly applicable to that larger discussion of clashing worldviews, of looking at different kinds of evidence, of considering things that are outside our worldview. I mean, ET is probably still more complicated than that, more confusing and strange than that, but there is crossover. And Mallory, that's the most one could ask is, look at the evidence. Go to these sites and be critical, but be open. Go to the What's Up with Where. If you go to the exostudies.org website, there's a resources menu, and it's got some great resources of books, articles, and a timeline, a really cool timeline of all the major events in study of, or not study, but kind of the UFO history field. And it's accelerated in the last 2 or 3 years.
Don't interrupt me. I'm
A
trying
number
to
of things, articles that have been published.
Gotta
And
turn
I mean,
this
look
off
at look
Okay,
what
bye.
Elon Musk just did. I mean, we're now entering space travel in a way we've never done before. And right now, physicists, astrophysicists, are documenting at an incredible pace exoplanets. We've documented 4,000 to 5,000 exoplanets already, something we couldn't even do just a few years ago. And there's estimates of, in our galaxy alone, there might be several billion habitable planets. Not just the ones that are in the Cinderella zone, which is the old definition of planets that are like Earth, but that astrophysics has been combined with earthbound biology that studies extremophiles. When you start to study organisms that live in deep ice, in vents, hot vents underneath, if they can do those things, live in those conditions, then what astrophysicists are now doing is expanding the range of habitability on planets, which increases just possibility. Businesses live in our universe, or just in our paper that was just made into the news last week. It was a calculation based on certain assumptions about habitability similar to the Drake equation, that there's 30 alien races, also at this time in our galaxy, I believe it was, and there's billions of galaxies. But yeah, that was widely picked up by the media, and that wouldn't have been widely picked up by the media even 10 years ago. It's just a good example. Thanks for pointing that out. Carolyn,
John?
I think this was a great overview of the general topic of attempting to connect people with something they're not familiar with. Right, I mean, there's probably a silent majority. Those people aren't the ones who are going to go to Facebook and be vocal. But at the same time, one has to understand and appreciate that the people who are being vocal are speaking from their authentic belief system. And that's totally legitimate. I mean, we all do. Just not all the same belief systems, of course.
So, John, I think there's a small delay,
Thank you, Cameron.
so I'm not sure.
Drake equation, very good theoretical science. The Drake equation has been updated several times. As we learn more about astronomy, theoretically we are producing more accurate assumptions in the Drake equation, but that certainly is famous, as is Carl Sagan's document. He's a whole interesting case too. See Samantha's writing.
Okay, John, I'm not sure if you can hear me. I think there's a delay. But Lindsay, I'm going to invite you to ask your question.
Did I miss other comments that people made?
Hi. Okay. Can you hear me okay? I can hear you fine. I'm not sure if you can.
Okay. Well, I'll go and then we'll see how this goes. And I apologize.
Do not need to believe in God or your clothes. Be respectful. Exactly.
Okay, go for it, Lindsay.
Hey, okay.
Can you repeat that, Emily?
It's okay, Lindsay. You can go for it.
Okay, sorry. I'm very interested because I looked. Okay.
You know what?
Or you say,
It's okay. You just go, and I will synthesize this for John.
Okay, perfect. So I'm interested. What I look at is the sort of like terrestrial ideas of protection around heritage objects in the age of space tourism, and how our current heritage protection ideas translate into outer space or don't. But what I often find to be a very interesting thought exercise is that if you are creating a like quote unquote museum in outer space, and potentially you had to create it for people who did not have the same cultural references as coming from Earth, what are the type of interpretive mechanisms that we take for granted in heritage and museums that we can sort of look to by using this. Now, for me, I have to say I use it purely as a thought exercise, but I find it interesting as a way to evaluate interpretive ideas. I hope you heard that.
So it sounds like, Lindsay, that he is missing, unfortunately he's not hearing you. So what I'm wondering is either two things. Either you're welcome to email John. I think he would love that conversation, and his email is on there. Or if you want to just briefly summarize and chat it, I think the chat is coming through.
Okay. Sorry. I bet it's my connection. I'm sorry.
No, actually, I think it's his. So he lives in Costa Rica. John, Lindsay's just going to briefly summarize it, and then this will probably be our last question. As we're waiting for Lindsay to type in her question, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for being part of this thought exercise and being willing to live in that space, even if you are a critic, and think about what it means from an interpretive perspective. I'd like to thank John for offering this perspective as well. It's something for us to ponder. And as I mentioned, very shortly when I close this out, a short survey will pop up. It gives you an opportunity to provide some feedback for John, as well as feedback to NAI of what other types of things you might like to see as a webinar, just in general, how this one struck you. And then also as one final comment, for those of you who are certified with NAI, this will automatically go in as 1.5 hours of continuing education. I will probably take note of that by the end of this week. So when you go to recertify, it will be very easy for you to do so because that hour will already, or hour and a half, will already be accounted for. All right, so John, it looks like Lindsay's question has come through. And I'm not sure if you're going to type or verbalize your response. Perhaps type, so it looks like you are doing that right now. Hopefully you can see John is responding in the chat box. I'm actually going to move a couple things so that we can see the chat coming in. So Lindsay's asking, how does a galactic heritage perspective challenge notions of heritage preservation and interpretation? John starts with there are several possible avenues. One is to look for galactic connections to stories. In fact, there are many. There's a whole field on galactic history. Channelers spend a lot of time in this area. But aside from that, heritage on Earth still has great value. All right, well, I'm going to give Lindsay and John a few more moments to go back and forth, and then I'm going to close out the session. Lindsay, I'd encourage you to grab that email address so that perhaps you two can continue this conversation. Right. Well, I appreciate the conversation, as I said, and the discourse. I think that's how we grow as interpreters. So once again, I appreciate all of your time and energy. And I'm going to close this out. And when I do so, a short survey will come. All right, have a great day, everyone.
Interesting articles that are posted in our publication, how might we then give the presenter or the writer an opportunity to go deeper and to talk more with a live audience via webinars? So John is actually our first adopter, which doesn't surprise me. He's usually like that. And I will give him an opportunity to introduce himself in a few moments.
This is great, yeah.
But let me sort of quickly walk you through the technology. Some of you said, gosh, I've been on Adobe Connect in a long time or ever. So from a user standpoint, if you look on the very top of your screen in that black bar that's across the top, you have the option to turn your microphone on. We are going to ask you to mute yourself until the Q&A at the end. But if you have questions for John throughout the presentation, because we will be together for an hour and a half, we're going to invite you to put those in the chat box. So John and I will both be monitoring those, but we're going to ask that you just ask questions via chat until the general Q&A at the end, in which case you can unmute yourself. If you have technical issues, I'm really tech support today, so if you have technical issues, I'm going to invite you to reach out to me. And you can do that in one of two ways. You can call me using the phone number that was in the email with the login instructions, or you can also start a private chat with me. And if you look below the webcam, you'll see there's a box that says attendees, and if you look at the very top, there are two hosts, myself and John. You can just hover over my name. You have the option to start a private chat with me, and then in the main chat room box below, there's a tab right now that says everyone, but there will be a new tab that opens that says Emily Jacobs. So if something happens with your audio, I'm happy to try to help troubleshoot that. If you get kicked out of the system, please just re-log in again. We will be recording